I've never heard of this before either. This is something I want to look up.
Yeah, basically they blame that on Cuba. So this goes to show that NASA and the U.S. government were indeed capable and indeed willing to let their astronauts die to satisfy their own agendas.
Now, I had heard somewhere Apollo 1, which, of course, tragically burned on the...
Yeah, I'll get to that just a moment if you want.
Okay.
Basically, I've asked Phil Plait a million times or whatever to talk, why won't you talk about Operation Dirty Trick? And he runs off with his tails between his legs. I even offered to show him the document, and he doesn't want to see it. He doesn't reply to me. Oh, no. And so, you asked her about the Apollo 1 fire.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's the story. The Apollo 1 was to be the first manned orbit of the Apollo capsule. This was just going to be an Earth orbit flight, and Grissom, he was selected to command this mission. Now, Gus Grissom, he was NASA's first astronaut to return into space. He had flown the Mercury, then he flew the Gemini. Now he's going to be the first to fly Apollo. Anyways, he was very, very dissatisfied with the Apollo capsule. He didn't believe that it was going to work, and in fact, just days before he died, he plucked a lemon off his tree and hung it on the spacecraft. I believe you guys in the U.S. have a term that lemons mean unworthy cars.
Unworthy
cars. Basically, he thought the spacecraft was non-space-worthy, basically. And so, when you're doing this test on the ground, they have pure oxygen inside the spacecraft. Now, what we're currently sitting in right now, the air we're in right now, is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, and it's a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. Now, these guys inside the capsule, they were sitting in 20 psi pure oxygen. And now, NASA, they had done many, many tests before this Apollo 1 incident, in which they'd have oxygen chamber tests, and these were only at about 5 pounds pressure, right? And each one of these tests would turn into a disaster. Like one of them had an incident with a light bulb, in which spark got loose and the chamber went on fire, an asbestos blanket caught fire, and two people died in one of these previous incidents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so NASA knew about these the dangers of pure oxygen, yet they sealed these guys inside the capsule, full of pure oxygen, full of all kinds of combustible materials, and they sealed them in with a hatch that has about 3 layers on it and can only be opened from the outside. It would take about 90 seconds or whatever to get open or whatever. See? Now, if you light a cigarette in about 5 psi pure oxygen, the cigarette will start to rapidly burn, faster than it normally does. However, if you set fire to a cigarette in 20 psi pure oxygen, the whole cigarette in your face and your hair and your clothes will go up in about 2 seconds.
Yeah, you get idiots in hospitals that tend to want to smoke even though they're on oxygen.
I know a couple of those.
Our grandfather.
My papa did that a couple of times.
Yeah, so basically they had Grissom inside this capsule, and they set fire to him. They have him in this pure oxygen thing. They knew the dangers. They pulled the fire extinguishers out before they put him in there. Would you believe that? They pulled the fire extinguishers out. They put They told the firemen, oh, don't worry about this. There's not going to be any launch today. It's just an oxygen test, and so basically they go up in flames.
Then are you saying that they killed him? Correct.
They killed him.
It was intentional. Yes.
Yeah, intentional. And later on, Frank Borman, you might not have heard of him. He was one of the astronauts. He was the first man one of the first men to orbit the moon, allegedly. This is later on after the fire. He was an assistant professor in thermodynamics, which means he knows about what goes hot and what goes cold, whatever. So he testifies before Congress, and he says, I don't believe that any of us realized that this test was going to be hazardous. Then later on in his testimony, he admits that they knew about these pure oxygen fires.
You'd have to.
Exactly.
If you know the chemicals, that would be...
You're NASA.
Yeah, you're NASA. You should know better than this. Now, I do have to ask a question. Now, do you think eventually that we will be able to go to the moon Or, you think we have the technology now to go to the moon?
No, we don't have the technology now to go to the moon. I don't think they'll have the technology by the time they're going to launch the Ars rockets. The next Ars, the first Ars rocket, I should say. The Ars rocket is what they're going to be using to replace the shuttle. They're planning on launching the first test launch of that sometime next year or the year after that. And they don't have the technology to get back to the moon. In fact, here's an interesting story. The new moon rockets that they're planning on building, the new ones, they're going to be building those using shuttle technology. And of course, the shuttle has been around since the 70s. After the Apollo landings, they decided, well, let's build this space plane, the shuttle, and they've had that since the 1970s. In fact, the first planning for it went in 1969, and so they've had this shuttle technology for so long. If they could return to the moon using this shuttle technology, which is what they're planning to do now, why didn't we go back earlier?
Well, that's one of the questions. I have two things that I've held to prove. First, one of them is something that was mentioned in MythBusters. There's at the end of the show, they went to this observatory and they flashed a laser up to the moon, and they hit a plaque or a plate that they left on the moon. Which bounced back, and she also showed that if you hit somewhere else, that it would scatter because of the dust. Now, that's one of the first things. Okay, well, they had to have been there to be able to plant the plaque.
Well, I'll tell you about the lasers if you want.
Well, sure.
Well, basically, they didn't mention this on the show, but in 1963, the New York Times released an article on November 5th, 1963. The New York Times, they released an article called "Soviet Bounce Light Beam Off Moon in a Laser Test." And in fact, this basically, the article was about how the Russians had bounced a laser beam off the moon and back down to Earth without any man-made objects up there.
Now, when was the plaque put on the on the moon, supposedly?
1969.
1969,
and this report came in 1963.
Okay,
so how did it happen?
Well, basically, the moon's surface itself can reflect laser beams without any problem. The MythBusters claim it can't, so either they're lying or the equipment was electronically set in NASA's favor.
And I think she showed that she couldn't bounce it off the moon. That it sent back, but that it had
fishy. If you can't,
sure.
If as they claim on the program, how did they do this back in the 1960s before they put those reflectors up there in the first place?
Now I remember reading something about the Russians were able supposedly to put some plaques on the moon using
the
59.
Yeah. They had a lunar cod rover.
Now you're saying they didn't hit those plaques; they hit just the moon itself.
Just the moon itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
This was long before the Russians put their reflectors up there. It was long before Neil Armstrong's "One Small Step for Man." This was years before that. And if your listeners out there want to check this out, you can more than welcome go to the library, find the New York Times article. It's the New York Times, November 5th, 1963. I also recommend this the December 1966 issue of National Geographic. It features an article by Thomas Malloy. It's called "The Laser's Bright Magic." He says, this is a direct quotation, 4 years ago, a ruby laser considerably smaller than those now available shot a series of pulses at the moon, 240,000 miles away. The beams illuminated a spot less than 2 miles in diameter and were reflected back to Earth with enough strength to be measured by ultra-sensitive electronic equipment.
Huh. Okay. Now, my second one goes to kind of back up maybe what you're saying. I don't understand, and this is something I've never been able to figure out, and I think one of the people that, that's been asked, that's been involved in this said, well, there's nothing there. Why haven't we been back to the moon if we could get there in the first place? All of a sudden we stop going to the moon. It's not even interesting to us anymore. And I'm thinking, we might need to be able to go back and forth to the moon. So why do you think we have not been back to the moon? Why did we stop going all of a sudden? If it's
the fact of the matter is that they stopped faking it because the Cold War was over now and everything. Sorry, the space race was over, and in fact they started making peace with the Russians afterwards. And so there's no reason to fake it. You know, they'd done the first moon landing, and also I believe they tried to limit the amount of footage that they wanted to fake as well. You see, like on Apollo 11, as I said earlier, it was really grainy footage and black and white and filmed off TV screens. They filmed off the TV screens in every single mission. On Apollo 12, the next mission, this was to be the first mission where they bring a color camera to the moon's surface.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what happens?
It turns black and white.
Well, Al Bean, he's setting the camera up. Al Bean, the fourth man on the moon, setting the camera up. Oh dear, here, should I put this here? He points it directly at the sun and burns the lens out. That's a little bit too bright, Al. Could you adjust it a bit? Hey, what change did you make? I just hit it with the top of my hammer. Didn't think we had a thing to lose.
No. Jeez.
Yeah. So basically, they fried the camera on Apollo 12. No footage at all, just still pictures and some audio communications. A few data acquisition 60mm reels that didn't really show much anyways. Then, of course, on Apollo 13, you might remember the film with Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. They had the near disaster in which the oxygen tank blows to smithereens, and, we have to reserve power. I guess we have to cancel the TV shows. Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, and then when they launched Apollo 14, they did bring the color camera to the moon, but you see, when you're filming an image, right, you have what's called the exposure setting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, exposure is about how much light you let into the camera. Okay, into the camera's lens.
Yeah.
And basically, they had the exposure setting up too high, so all the surface is all overexposed. It comes out as white and fuzzy. You know, it's just poor quality footage again. Plus, they're filming it off the TV screens. Then finally, they had the missions, the last three missions. They were called the J-type missions, in which they had the lunar rover. The lunar rover had the little onboard camera on there, right? And the thing is, right, they'd only film the moonscape. They'd only film their activities on the moon when after they'd finished driving. Like there was no, they didn't record any videos of the lunar rover traveling for miles and miles and miles across the moonscape. There would just be audio communications. Okay, we stopped here. Let's roll some film. Okay, let's go somewhere else. Switch it off. Let's go. And that was it, really.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they limited the amount of footage that they'd have to fake. And of course, by now they've sent up hundreds of space shuttle flights. The less you fake, the less high your chances are of exposing yourself. Really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and of course, if you're trying to limit your chances of getting exposed, what better way than to limit the amount of footage that you're recording?